Welcome to our November Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Niki Roach, and this is a monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a MiniPod because it'll only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. So each MiniPod, I'm joined by an environmental expert guest, and we explore 3 issues that are making the headlines, keeping you up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guests see exciting possibilities. And this MiniPod, I'm joined by the Junior President of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management and Principal Flood Risk Analyst at JBA Consulting, Peter Rook. And we'll be talking about the impact of a Trump presidency on global climate and our environment, what reforms to the planning system here in England and Wales might mean, and how AI can increase our resilience to flooding and environmental risks. So welcome to the MiniPod, Peter.
Thank you very much, Niki. Love your podcast, so it's great to be a guest of honour on it.
It's wonderful to have you here. So let's start, Peter, with the big news of the last week, which is that the US has elected a new president. And regardless of our politics, it has the potential to have some significant changes for the role the US plays in our environment. So I know you've done a bit of work looking at the differences between Republican and Democratic stands on some key environmental issues. What are the headlines that you pulled out from that?
I think the really interesting thing about the election result is, unlike a lot of incoming presidents, Trump is something of a known quantity. It's not going to be too surprising. We have a track record to look at on the environment. I think one of the key headlines from a Trump presidency previously was that he withdrew the US from a Paris Agreement, which obviously is a commitment to reduce carbon emissions. And as one of the biggest, I think the second biggest carbon emitter out of all countries on the planet, that was massively significant. Obviously, since then, under the Biden administration, the US has readmitted into the Paris Agreement. And that's really important because I think the work we're doing in the UK and the ambition to reach net zero is really great. But ultimately, climate change is a global issue. And if we don't get the major carbon emitters such as the US, which I think is the second highest globally after China, on board with limiting emissions, then we have a serious problem.
Yes, and I also picked up as well that they might withdraw from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as well as the Paris Agreement. So we've got COP coming up very soon, COP29 in Azerbaijan, and I guess there's the risk that future COPs may not have the US at them, which will have an impact on kind of global climate cooperation, won't it? So yeah, big news. So beyond kind of climate change, if there is anything beyond climate change, but what else have you seen that's kind of stuck out to you, Peter?
So the previous Trump administration also weakened or revoked almost 100 different environmental regulations during the presidency, most of which have already been implemented. And they cover a massive range of topics, really. So one was allowing oil and gas exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. Another was revoking directives of federal agencies to minimize impacts on water, wildlife, and land when approving major development projects. Others were things about scaling back pollution protections for certain tributaries and wetlands that were regulated under the Clean Water Act, and even endangered species. So they actually removed the grey wolf from the endangered species list. So really, Trump's changes to environmental regulations and legislation covered almost every aspect of the environment beyond climate change. It was, water quality, biodiversity, our environment in general. So I think it's fair to say the environment probably isn't a major policy area for Donald Trump. He's got a lot of, or at least previously, he had a lot of climate change deniers in his cabinet. I don't really see there'll be any reason why he would do things differently this time.
Yeah, it's pretty stark, isn't it? I mean, one piece of information I picked up from Carbon Brief, actually, which I think is a brilliant source of quite objective and evidence-led discussion on these kind of topics, was that there's some support from a kind of clean energy generation viewpoint in the Trump campaign around nuclear. Now, I appreciate that in itself has challenges, but there is at least some seed of something that's green energy rather than just drill, baby, drill, which is, I think, what we heard quite a lot on the campaign trail, wasn't it? So from your perspective, you're an early career professional, Peter. So you've been working in this sector 8-9 years, something like that. How much of an impact do you think global conversations around climate and the environment will have, for example, on the UK or on Europe? Does it feel very removed from your perspective, or do you feel really plugged into it?
I feel somewhat plugged into it. The thing with climate and environmental change is that it is inherently a global issue. Environmental issues, climate change, it doesn't respect borders, it doesn't respect sovereign nations, and ultimately we need to get the countries which are having the biggest environmental impact on board with the scale and pace of change. So it does affect me, it does affect all of us, because the US is a major polluter.
I picked up a quote from a professor at Princeton, Navrov Dubash. He said, "It's critical that the world not bend backwards to try and mould the climate regime around the vagaries of US political currents, nor press pause on building out critical elements of the climate regime." And I think as we move into COP29 in the next couple of weeks, it'll be really interesting to see whether that thought around the global community coming together, even though, as you say, the US, a major player and historically the biggest emitter of carbon, actually, even if they may not be at the table moving forward, whether that has a big impact on the direction of travel for conversations. I think we'll all be watching with a lot of interest. Right, let's lift ourselves, if we can, out of the US election for a moment and move to something a little bit more local. So you've been looking at potential planning reforms here in the UK. What's caught your eye?
One of the things that's caught my eye is the sequential test. So for those who don't have a background in flood and coastal erosion risk management, the sequential test is a key policy for where we place new developments. On the face of it, it sounds quite simple. Generally, don't place your new developments in the areas which flood. But there was a change made to the National Planning Policy Framework in 2021. It was a very small change. Previously, the sequential test just looked at river and sea flooding. But the change was that the sequential test had to consider all sources of flooding, both now and in the future. And again, on the face of it, seems like quite a sensible change. We need to factor in climate change and other sources of flood risk, which I think is something a lot of lead local flood authorities have been calling for quite some time. However, because this was a very top-down decision and change to policy, perhaps it hadn't quite been considered how you actually apply the sequential test to, say, surface water flooding, which can be quite granular, quite dependent on local drainage systems, or groundwater, where we don't have very many competent data sets actually showing us risk. So what we've had is this situation where an environmental regulation with a very well-intentioned environmental regulation is in some areas acting as a blocker for new development and actually not really protecting the environment in the way it's been intended anyway, because developers try and find loopholes and ways to get around it. So I think it's a great example of how we can have a policy that has good intentions, but we need it to work at the same time. And we need it to still be strong enough to act as an incentive to actually do what we want it to do, which is to manage flood risk to new developments and build that resilience in our communities. Obviously, in the UK, we have a housing shortage at the moment. And I think particularly if you're a younger person struggling to get on the housing ladder, you've almost got this false dichotomy with developers and even some younger people who might say, well, ultimately, the environment's great, but we want to be able to buy our own property at a younger age. And as a younger person, I completely understand that perspective. But at the same time, I think we don't want to get trapped in this viewpoint where it's the environment versus house building and development and economic growth. And I think this is, to an extent, what you've also had in the USA. I mean, you've got this Trump, we want jobs in the economy almost, and the environment is just a blocker that's getting in our way to achieve that. So a really great example of this in the UK is Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act. In effect, it would set up what we call SUDs, or Sustainable Drainage System Approval Bodies. And those organisations would have powers to approve, adopt and maintain SUDs. And in 2015, the government did try to enact this. But actually what happened was there was a lot of opposition from housing developers and house builders. And this got watered down so that lead local flood authorities became a consultee to the planning system, which meant whilst they could advise on these sustainable drainage systems, they weren't the ultimate approvers or decision makers. It was a role I started my career in, actually. I think I experienced quite a lot of times you wouldn't be consulted on things sometimes, or planners would decide there are other more important issues at stake. But the great thing about Schedule 3 is it would have the potential to just take suds and the environment from that perspective outside of planning, and it would be completely within the remit of the SAB, or suds approving body, to approve the suds, to approve sustainable drainage systems.
The challenges here are who owns these assets, who approves these assets. But actually, the thing that they're going to do, one of the things they're going to do is improve water quality, slow the flow of water down in the landscape. We've just seen, in other parts of the world, horrific flooding from extreme rainfall events. The more resilient we can make our systems to those kind of extreme rainfall events, the better. And that's one of the roles that these kind of sustainable drainage systems form. So I think actually if the public understood the link between, you want better water quality in your rivers, quite understandably, we all do. We want to slow the flow of water down so we don't end up with flooding as well and pollution incidents. And this is one way of doing that. But actually, the challenge is quite a technical challenge, isn't it? Which is about who approves, who owns, and who pays for. But I mean, Wales have adopted Schedule 3, so it's not like it's beyond the realm of possibility. So I think it's a really interesting one that, again, is bubbling under the surface. But if you talk to anyone that works in the world of drainage, it feels like the one thing that if the government could just make happen, it would make a world of difference, wouldn't it? So, okay, I'm going to lift us out of the technical world of sustainable urban drainage for a moment. I know that the third topic that you wanted to talk about, and when I asked you, think about what's possible and what's exciting for you, you thought about how AI can increase resilience to flooding and environmental risk. So tell me a little bit more about what your thoughts are there, Peter.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating topic, AI, and it's remarkable how quickly change can happen. And I think what we really need to be doing is looking at new and emerging technologies and ways of working to manage the challenges of the future, really. So a short time ago, people, probably including myself here, were thinking of AI and machine learning much as sort of science fiction. But in the space of a short couple of years, really, it's becoming a regular part of our working lives. I have been using it on a day-to-day basis, actually, and I think the possibilities for using it in other areas are endless. I mean, I, for example, did a bit of an experiment where I fed it something called the OBCAM manual, which sets out how the Environment Agency considers asset condition. I fed it photos of assets from a site and got it to actually use the manual and assess those asset conditions. So I think one of the areas where we all seem to be struggling as an industry is asset maintenance and management. So would it not be great, more efficient for everyone if we had smart sensor technology, for example, which could detect when a basin was starting to fill up with silt? It could use some sort of image analysis, and we were able to target and better prioritize maintenance regimes to where it's needed, not just say we're going to review and maintain this asset once every 2 years or 3 years. This ties into SUDs as well. SUDs are great, but they still need maintenance. It's still engineering. You can't just leave them to sort of get on with it. I think asset management is definitely a key area where we could really be using AI and smart technologies to improve our resilience to climate change.
I don't normally offer the Planet Possible magic wand on the MiniPod, Peter, but I'm going to offer it to you because it feels like the right moment. Okay, so in the space of AI and improving our resilience, if you were to wave the Planet Possible magic wand, what would you want to make possible in order to achieve that? What's the enabler to faster adoption, do you think?
I think we need to be a lot more experimental, and I think companies in particular need to be starting to take a lead from their early career professionals on this, actually. They can really play a key role in this as they're not constrained from having done things a certain way for decades on end. And I think if companies start listening to their creativity and the ways they can use AI to improve and enhance their own work, we can really start leading on using this for environmental change. Obviously, there are challenges. I mean, I think, for example, Niki, you highlighted that there are energy usage issues with AI, and every time you run a query, it uses a certain amount of energy. And I think those can be addressed in time, but we need companies to start listening to the early careers people who are using AI technologies and really start to say, great, well, you're using it for X, Y, Z. How can we incorporate this into our own workflows, our own ways of working to further deliver environmental benefits?
Brilliant. Oh, thank you, Peter. That's about all we've got time for. So thank you so much for joining us. You've definitely given me plenty to think about, and I'm sure you've given our listeners plenty to think about too. A thank you to you for joining us on the MiniPod. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and we love to hear your ratings and reviews too. We've got some more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year too, so I hope you'll join us for those. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guest, Peter Rook. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.